26th of January, 1943. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a gray dawn sky, its surface deceptively calm as death prowled in its depths. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton, nicknamed Mush by his crew, gripped the periscope handles of the USS Wahoo, his weathered face illuminated by the submarine's red combat lighting. For 14 grueling hours, he had orchestrated what would become one of the most devastating and controversial submarine attacks in naval warfare history. The 41-year-old submarine commander from Owensboro, Kentucky, possessed the kind of aggressive tactical genius that the United States Navy desperately needed in the Pacific theater. Morton had earned his reputation as one of America's most feared submarine aces, transforming the Wahoo into a legendary predator that haunted Japanese shipping lanes like a mechanical shark. His philosophy was simple yet ruthless: sink everything that flew the rising sun flag. "Battle stations, torpedo!" Morton commanded through the intercom, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had already sent countless enemy vessels to the ocean floor. The cramped submarine hummed with deadly efficiency as 79 crew members prepared for what they believed would be another routine attack on a Japanese convoy. Executive Officer Richard Hetherington O'Kane, a sharp-eyed Californian who would later become a submarine legend himself, stood ready at Morton's shoulder, calculating firing solutions with mechanical precision. Through the periscope's crosshairs, Morton observed his target, the Japanese transport vessel Buyo Maru, a 5,000-ton freighter carrying what intelligence reports suggested was military cargo bound for Tihi war-torn islands of the South Pacific. The ship moved with the ponderous grace of a vessel heavily laden with supplies, escorted by destroyers that cut protective patterns through the morning swells. What Morton and his crew didn't know, what Allied intelligence had failed to discover, was that the Buyo Maru carried far more than military supplies. Hidden in the vessel's overcrowded holds were 1,126 Japanese soldiers, but also 269 Indian prisoners of war from the British 16th Punjab Regiment. These were men who had been captured during Japan's lightning conquest of Southeast Asia, survivors of brutal battles in Burma and Malaya, who now found themselves trapped aboard what the Allies would later categorize as a hell ship. The Indian soldiers, far from their homeland's dusty plains and mountain passes, had endured months of captivity under conditions that violated every principle of the Geneva Convention. Crowded into stifling cargo holds with minimal food, water, or sanitation, they represented one of the war's countless forgotten tragedies. Their presence aboard the Buyo Maru would soon transform what appeared to be a legitimate military target into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. According to records from the Naval History and Heritage Command, Morton had been stalking this convoy for hours, using the Wahoo's superior underwater speed and stealth to position himself for the perfect attack. The submarine's 24 torpedoes represented months of careful preparation and training, each weapon calibrated for maximum destructive impact against enemy shipping. "Firing solution ready, Captain," O'Kane reported, his slide rule calculations translating the convoy's speed, bearing, and distance into the mathematical formula for death. The torpedo room crews stood ready, their faces tense with the familiar mixture of excitement and dread that preceded combat. Morton pressed his eye against the periscope one final time, studying the Buyo Maru's profile against the horizon. In his mind, he saw only another enemy transport carrying troops and supplies to reinforce Japanese positions across the Pacific. The intelligence briefings had been clear. Every ship sunk meant fewer resources for the enemy's war machine, potentially saving American lives during future amphibious assaults. The decision to fire represented more than tactical calculation. It embodied America's total war strategy against Imperial Japan. Following the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor just over a year earlier, submarine commanders like Morton operated under increasingly aggressive rules of engagement. The Pacific had become an arena where mercy was considered a luxury that could cost Allied lives. "Fire 1, Morton commanded, initiating a sequence of events that would reverberate through naval history for decades to come. The Mark 14 torpedo erupted from tube number 1 with a compressed air hiss that vibrated through the Wahoo's steel hull. 65 feet beneath the Pacific's surface, the deadly fish streaked toward the Buyo Maru at 46 knots, its magnetic exploder designed to detonate beneath the target's keel for maximum catastrophic damage. Morton kept his eye pressed to the periscope, watching the torpedo's phosphorescent wake slice through the dark water like a messenger of doom. "Time to target, 2 minutes, 30 seconds, Executive Officer O'Kane announced, his stopwatch marking the seconds until impact. The submarine's crew maintained absolute silence, their breathing shallow as they waited for confirmation of their deadly handiwork. In the torpedo room, Chief Petty Officer William Thomas prepared additional weapons, knowing that Morton rarely settled for a single killing blow. The explosion, when it came, exceeded even Morton's expectations. The torpedo struck the Buyo Maru amidships, the magnetic exploder functioning perfectly as it detonated directly beneath the transport's loaded cargo holds. A massive column of water, steam, and debris erupted skyward, visible even through the periscope's limited field of view. The 5,000-ton vessel shuddered like a mortally wounded animal, its steel backbone broken by the underwater blast. "Beautiful shot, Mush," O'Kane exclaimed, using Morton's nickname with the familiarity of men who had shared countless dangerous missions together. Through the periscope, they watched the Buyo Maru's death throes as secondary explosions rippled through the ship's interior, igniting fuel bunkers and ammunition stores that the crew had never suspected were aboard. What neither American officer could see from their underwater vantage point was the human catastrophe unfolding within the transport's fractured hull. In the overcrowded troop compartments, Japanese soldiers scrambled for emergency stations, while their Indian prisoners, shackled and locked below decks, faced a more desperate situation. The ship's rapid listing to starboard trapped many men in flooding compartments, their screams lost beneath the roar of incoming seawater. Captain Shunzo Gyoten, commanding the Buyo Maru, transmitted a final distress signal before ordering abandon ship. His crew launched every available lifeboat, but with nearly 1,400 souls aboard, the evacuation became a nightmare of panic and desperation. Japanese soldiers, trained to view surrender as the ultimate dishonor, fought to reach lifeboats while simultaneously trying to maintain discipline among their prisoners. The Indian prisoners of war, many weakened by months of inadequate food and brutal treatment, found themselves in an impossible situation. Some Japanese guards, following standing orders, attempted to prevent the prisoners from reaching lifeboats, viewing them as expendable cargo rather than human beings protected by international law. Other guards, facing death themselves, abandoned their posts in the chaos of the sinking ship. According to survivor accounts later compiled by British intelligence, approximately 200 men went down with the Buyo Maru in those first 3 minutes after the torpedo strike. The lucky ones drowned quickly in the flooded compartments. Others found themselves trapped in air pockets, facing a slower death as the transport settled toward the ocean floor 2 miles below. From the Wahoo's periscope, Morton observed approximately 20 lifeboats scattered across the debris field, their occupants appearing as tiny figures against the vast Pacific. The submarine commander faced a tactical decision that would haunt naval historians for decades. Should he surface to confirm the kill and potentially rescue survivors, or should he remain submerged and continue hunting the convoy's remaining vessels? "Take her up to periscope depth," Morton commanded, bringing the Wahoo closer to the surface for a better view of the destruction. The submarine's ballast tanks hissed as compressed air displaced seawater, lifting the vessel through the thermocline toward the morning sunlight. What Morton saw through the periscope's magnified lens changed everything. The lifeboats weren't simply drifting passively. Some appeared to contain armed men who were frantically signaling to the convoys escorting destroyers. In the confusion following the torpedo attack, the Japanese naval escorts had scattered, apparently unaware that an American submarine lurked nearby. "They're trying to vector the destroyers onto our position," O'Kane observed grimly, studying the lifeboat survivors through binoculars. "If they succeed, we'll have half the Imperial Navy dropping depth charges on our heads." Morton nodded slowly, his tactical mind already calculating the next move in this deadly chess game. "Surface the boat," Morton commanded with the cold calculation that had made him the Pacific Fleet's most feared submarine commander. The Wahoo's ballast tanks erupted in a symphony of rushing air and cascading water as the submarine broke through the Pacific's surface like a breaching whale. Sunlight flooded the control room as Morton and O'Kane climbed through the conning tower hatch onto the bridge, their eyes immediately scanning the debris field that marked the Buyo Maru's grave. The scene before them defied their expectations of a typical sinking. Instead of helpless survivors clinging to wreckage, they observed what appeared to be organized resistance. Several lifeboats had been lashed together, creating larger platforms that bristled with the unmistakable silhouettes of rifle barrels and machine gun positions. The survivors weren't simply awaiting rescue, they had transformed their lifeboats into floating fortresses. "Jesus Christ, Mush, they're armed to the teeth," O'Kane muttered, adjusting his binoculars for a clearer view. According to his later account recorded in naval intelligence files, approximately 1,000 survivors floated in the debris field, far more than a typical transport crew would number. The mathematical impossibility suggested that the Buyo Maru had been carrying troops rather than simple cargo, validating Morton's decision to attack what he considered a legitimate military target. Chief Petty Officer William Thomas emerged from the Wahoo's forward gun mount, leading a crew of sailors who had trained extensively in surface gunnery tactics. The submarine's 4-inch deck gun represented one of the most effective anti-surface weapons in the Pacific theater, capable of destroying everything from fishing boats to destroyers with its high-explosive shells. What Morton and his crew couldn't distinguish from their surface position was the true composition of the survivors floating before them. The lifeboats contained not only Japanese soldiers but also the Indian prisoners of war who had been trapped aboard the transport. Many of these men wore the same khaki uniforms as their captors, making visual identification impossible from the Wahoo's bridge. The language barriers and desperate circumstances had created a nightmare scenario where victims and captors were indistinguishable. The first shots came from lifeboat number 7, approximately 200 yards off the submarine's starboard bow. Rifle fire cracked across the water, the bullets whining overhead as Japanese soldiers attempted to drive the American submarine away from their position. The shots weren't particularly accurate, fired from unstable platforms by men who had just survived a catastrophic sinking, but they represented a clear act of hostile intent that changed the tactical situation completely. "Return fire," Morton ordered without hesitation. The decision, recorded in the Wahoo's official patrol report, was based on standard submarine warfare doctrine that permitted commanders to defend their vessels against any hostile action. The 4-inch gun crew swung their weapon toward the largest concentration of lifeboats, their training taking over despite the unusual nature of their targets. Information gathered from the United States Naval Institute's archives reveals that Morton's decision was influenced by recent intelligence reports describing Japanese soldiers' increasing willingness to fight to the death rather than surrender. Several submarines had reported being fired upon by survivors of ships they had sunk, leading Pacific Fleet commanders to authorize aggressive responses to any hostile action. The Wahoo's first shell exploded in the water between two lifeboats, sending up a towering column of spray that drenched the survivors and demonstrated the submarine's overwhelming firepower. The psychological impact was immediate. Many of the lifeboats began to scatter, their occupants rowing frantically to escape the American vessel's guns. But some boats held their positions, their occupants continuing to fire rifles and at least one light machine gun at the surfaced submarine. The persistent resistance convinced Morton that he faced not helpless survivors, but determined enemy soldiers who would continue fighting until they were eliminated or rescued by Japanese naval forces. "Target the armed boats first," Morton instructed his gun crew, prioritizing military threats over humanitarian concerns. The decision represented the harsh calculus of submarine warfare, where a commander's first responsibility was always the safety of his own crew. Unknown to Morton, his next commands would create one of World War II's most controversial incidents. The Wahoo's 4-inch gun roared to life with mechanical precision, its high explosive shell screaming across the debris field at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The projectile struck lifeboat number 12, directly amidships, disintegrating the wooden craft in a thunderous explosion that sent bodies and debris flying across the blood-stained Pacific. Chief Petty Officer Thomas and his gun crew worked with deadly efficiency, their months of training transforming them into an unstoppable killing machine. "Load high explosive, target bearing 090, Thomas barked to his crew, identifying another lifeboat that continued to flash rifle fire toward the submarine. The breech mechanism slammed shut with metallic finality as another shell prepared to join the carnage. Morton observed the action through binoculars, his face expressing the grim satisfaction of a predator eliminating threats to his pack. Executive Officer O'Kane maintained the Wahoo's position log, recording each shot fired and target engaged according to standard patrol procedures. His meticulous documentation would later become crucial evidence in the investigation that followed the incident. According to his official report, filed with Pacific Fleet Headquarters, the submarine engaged 21 separate lifeboats over a period of approximately 1 hour, expending 43 rounds of 4-inch ammunition. What the American crew couldn't comprehend from their position on the submarine's bridge was the true horror unfolding in the lifeboats. The Indian prisoners of war, already weakened by months of captivity and the trauma of the sinking, found themselves trapped between their Japanese captors and American shells. Many had no weapons and no way to signal their identity to the attacking submarine. They could only huddle in the bottom of lifeboats while high-explosive rounds detonated around them. Some of the Japanese soldiers, following their military training, continued to return fire even as their comrades died around them. The Bushido Code that governed imperial military conduct demanded resistance to the death rather than surrender, creating a tactical situation where ceasing fire was not a viable option for either side. The Japanese believed that showing weakness would invite even more aggressive American attacks. The machine gun fire from the lifeboats intensified as Morton ordered the Wahoo to close range for more accurate shooting. Bullets struck the submarine's conning tower and bridge structure, creating the distinctive metallic ringing sound that submarine veterans would remember for the rest of their lives. One round shattered the periscope housing, sending glass fragments across the bridge and demonstrating that the survivors posed a legitimate threat to the submarine's operational capability. "They're trying to disable our optics," O'Kane reported, brushing glass from his uniform jacket. The tactical assessment was accurate. Several lifeboats had concentrated their fire on the Wahoo's periscope and bridge areas, attempting to blind the submarine and force it to withdraw. The strategy showed sophisticated military thinking that validated Morton's belief that he faced trained soldiers rather than merchant seamen. According to naval intelligence records compiled after the war, the Japanese 26th Field Ordnance Depot detachment aboard the Buyo Maru included specialists trained in anti-submarine warfare tactics. These men understood that forcing an enemy submarine to submerge would limit its ability to continue surface attacks and might allow some survivors to escape before Japanese naval forces arrived in the area. The fourth lifeboat exploded under direct fire from the Wahoo's gun, its occupants disappearing in a cloud of smoke and flying debris. Morton observed the destruction through his binoculars, counting the boats that had been eliminated and calculating how many remained capable of threatening his submarine. The tactical mathematics were simple. Every boat that continued to return fire represented a potential threat to his crew's survival. "Shift fire to the cluster at bearing 120, Morton commanded, identifying a group of lifeboats that had lashed themselves together for mutual support. The concentration of survivors created a larger target that his gun crew could engage more effectively, but it also meant that each shell would inflict maximum casualties among both combatants and prisoners. The systematic destruction continued as the morning sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky, casting harsh shadows across a seascape that had been transformed into a floating slaughterhouse. Private Gurmit Singh of the 2nd Battalion, 16th Punjab Regiment, clung to the splintered remains of lifeboat number 15 as another American shell exploded 50 yards to his left, sending up a geyser of seawater mixed with human blood. The 23-year-old soldier from the village of Jalandhar had survived the Japanese conquest of Burma, months of brutal captivity, and the torpedo attack that sank the Buyo Maru, only to find himself caught in a nightmare that defied comprehension. The Indian prisoners of war scattered throughout the lifeboats possessed no weapons with which to defend themselves or signal their identity to the attacking submarine. Many still wore the tattered remains of British uniforms beneath Japanese-issued clothing, but from the Wahoo's bridge, these distinctions were invisible. The language barriers that had isolated them during captivity now became death sentences as they couldn't communicate their non-combatant status to their American attackers. Sergeant Major Rajan Nair, a veteran of frontier campaigns along the northwest frontier, used his leadership experience to organize the Indian prisoners in his lifeboat. The 40-year-old career soldier from Kerala had spent 2 decades serving the British Raj, fighting tribal insurgents and preparing for the war that eventually consumed his regiment in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Now he found himself trying to keep 30 men alive while explosions detonated around their fragile craft. "Stay low. Don't make sudden movements," Nair whispered in Hindi to the men around him, his voice barely audible above the sound of rifle fire and exploding shells. Several Japanese guards in their boat continued to shoot at the submarine, apparently believing that resistance might force the Americans to withdraw. The Indian prisoners could only huddle in the bottom of the boat, praying that the next shell would miss their position. The Japanese soldiers faced their own desperate situation, bound by military codes that prohibited surrender while simultaneously recognizing the hopelessness of their tactical position. Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto, commanding the surviving troops from the 26th Field Ordnance Depot, attempted to coordinate resistance from his lifeboat using hand signals and shouted commands. The career officer from Kumamoto Prefecture understood that his men faced annihilation, but his training demanded continued resistance regardless of the odds. Some lifeboats attempted to surrender by waving white cloth, but the chaotic conditions and language barriers prevented effective communication with the attacking submarine. The white flags went unnoticed or were misinterpreted as ruses by the American crew, who had been trained to expect Japanese forces to fight to the death rather than surrender. Previous encounters with fanatical resistance had conditioned submarine commanders to view any Japanese military action as potentially deceptive. Lance Corporal Bharat Chandra, an 18-year-old from Uttar Pradesh who had been captured during the fall of Singapore, watched in horror as an American shell struck the lifeboat directly ahead of his position. The explosion obliterated the wooden craft and its 30 occupants, sending body parts flying through the air to splash into the crimson-stained Pacific. The young soldier had joined the British Indian Army to serve the Empire and escape rural poverty, never imagining that he would die in a naval battle far from his homeland. The systematic destruction continued as Morton's gun crew methodically engaged each lifeboat that showed signs of resistance or contained visible weapons. The Americans couldn't distinguish between willing combatants and unwilling prisoners, leading to indiscriminate killing that violated international law regarding the treatment of shipwreck survivors. The Hague Convention of 1907 specifically prohibited attacking survivors of maritime disasters, but these provisions assumed clear identification of non-combatants. As reported in post-war intelligence assessments compiled by the British War Office, approximately 195 Indian prisoners of war died during the submarine's gunnery attack, compared to 87 Japanese military personnel. The disproportionate casualties among the prisoners reflected their inability to seek cover or defend themselves during the hour-long bombardment. The survivors who remained in the water faced additional challenges, as fuel oil from the sunken transport created slicks that burned their eyes and made swimming difficult. Shark attacks began within hours of the sinking, drawn by the blood and struggling bodies that dotted the debris field. Many men who survived the torpedo attack and the submarine's guns would eventually die from exposure, drowning, or predator attacks before rescue arrived. Lieutenant Commander Morton lowered his binoculars as the last lifeboat capable of returning fire disappeared beneath a direct hit from the Wahoo's deck gun. The debris field that marked the Buyo Maru's grave now contained only scattered wreckage and the occasional survivor clinging to floating debris, their capacity for organized resistance effectively eliminated. Chief Petty Officer Thomas secured the 4-inch gun and reported 43 rounds expended, a devastating barrage that had transformed the morning seascape into a maritime graveyard. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically during the hour-long surface action. Radio intercepts indicated that Japanese naval forces were vectoring destroyers toward the contact area, drawn by the Buyo Maru's final distress transmission and reports from other convoy vessels. Morton faced a classic submarine command decision: continue operations in increasingly dangerous waters or withdraw to fight another day. Executive Officer O'Kane completed his preliminary damage assessment, reporting that the Wahoo had sustained minimal damage from the lifeboat survivors' return fire. Several bullet holes in the conning tow ear fairwater and one shattered periscope housing represented the extent of Japanese success during the engagement. The submarine's primary systems remained fully operational, maintaining the vessel's ability to continue combat operations or execute an emergency dive if enemy surface forces appeared. "Secure from battle stations, prepare to dive," Morton commanded through the intercom, initiating the standard submarine protocol for withdrawing from surface action. The crew responded with practiced efficiency, sealing hatches and preparing ballast tank systems for rapid submersion. The Wahoo's survival depended on maintaining the element of surprise that made submarine warfare so effective against enemy shipping. According to declassified Navy Department files, Morton's decision to attack the lifeboats was later reviewed by Pacific Fleet commanders who initially supported their aggressive submarine. Vice Admiral Charles Andrews Lockwood, commanding Pacific Submarine Operations, endorsed Morton's actions in his official report, stating that resistance from armed survivors justified the use of deadly force in self-defense. The intelligence assessment that followed the patrol painted a complex picture of the engagement. Naval intelligence determined that the Buyo Maru had indeed been carrying military personnel and equipment, validating the original decision to attack the transport. However, the presence of Indian prisoners of war among the casualties created diplomatic complications that would resonate throughout the Allied command structure. British officials, informed of the incident through intelligence sharing agreements, expressed concern about the high casualty rate among Commonwealth forces. The Indian prisoners of war had been serving under British command when captured, making their deaths during an American attack a sensitive political issue that required careful handling at the highest levels of Allied cooperation. Morton's patrol report, filed upon the Wahoo's return to Pearl Harbor, described the engagement in clinical terms that emphasized tactical necessity over humanitarian concerns. The document stated that armed resistance from survivors justified the submarine's use of surface gunnery to eliminate potential threats to the vessel's safety. The report made no mention of possible non-combatants among the casualties. The crew's reaction to the incident varied significantly, depending on their position during the action. Men who had observed the engagement through periscopes and binoculars reported seeing organized resistance that justified aggressive response. Others, working below decks during the surface action, learned about the lifeboat attacks only through shipboard gossip and official announcements. Seaman First Class Robert Walsh, a 19-year-old from Boston serving his first combat patrol, later described the mixed emotions that followed the action. The young sailor expressed pride in his submarine's tactical success while acknowledging discomfort with the unusual nature of attacking survivors in lifeboats. His personal diary, preserved in Naval War College archives, revealed the psychological complexity of submarine warfare during the Pacific Campaign. The strategic implications of the Buyo Maru incident extended far beyond a single submarine patrol. Intelligence analysis revealed that Japanese forces were increasingly using merchant vessels and transports to move military personnel and equipment, creating situations where attacks on apparently civilian targets were actually legitimate military operations. The blurred lines between combatant and non-combatant presented submarine commanders with increasingly difficult tactical decisions. As the Wahoo submerged and departed the engagement area, Morton began planning his next attack on the remaining convoy vessels, unaware that his actions would eventually become one of World War II's most controversial submarine incidents. The USS Wahoo's return to Pearl Harbor on February 8, 1943, marked the end of what Pacific Fleet Headquarters initially celebrated as one of the war's most successful submarine patrols. Lieutenant, Commander Morton's aggressive tactics had resulted in 8 confirmed vessel sinkings, establishing the submarine as one of the deadliest predators prowling Japanese shipping lanes. The boat's triumphant entry into port, marked by a broom lashed to the periscope to signify a clean sweep of enemy targets, masked the growing controversy surrounding the lifeboat incident. Vice Admiral Charles Andrews Lockwood, the silver-haired veteran who commanded Pacific submarine operations from his headquarters overlooking Pearl Harbor, reviewed Morton's patrol report with the calculating eye of a commander who understood the brutal mathematics of submarine warfare. The 62-year-old admiral from Virginia had spent decades perfecting the tactics that were slowly strangling Japan's maritime supply lines, and aggressive commanders like Morton represented the sharp edge of America's underwater sword. Lockwood's initial assessment, documented in his official endorsement of the patrol report, strongly supported Morton's actions during the Buyo Maru engagement. The admiral's statement emphasized that armed resistance from survivors justified the use of deadly force to protect American submarines and their crews. According to Lockwood's analysis, Japanese military personnel who continued fighting after their ship was sunk remained legitimate military targets under international law governing naval warfare. The intelligence briefings that followed the patrol provided additional justification for Morton's controversial decision. Naval intelligence officers presented evidence that Japanese forces were increasingly using deception tactics, including false surrender attempts and concealed weapons among survivor groups. Several submarine commanders had reported being fired upon by apparently helpless survivors, creating a tactical environment where mercy could prove fatal to American crews. Captain John Cromwell, serving as Lockwood's chief of staff, prepared a detailed analysis of the incident for transmission to Washington. The 48-year-old staff officer from Illinois argued that submarine warfare's unique conditions required commanders to make split-second decisions based on incomplete information. The report emphasized that Morton's crew had observed organized resistance and weapons fire from the lifeboats, creating a legitimate self-defense situation. The strategic context of the Pacific War influenced official reaction to the incident at the highest levels of military command. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign required constant submarine interdiction of Japanese supply lines, making aggressive submarine tactics a crucial component of Allied strategy. Military leaders understood that excessive restrictions on submarine commanders could undermine the effectiveness of America's most successful anti-shipping weapon. Admiral Ernest King, commanding the United States Navy from his Pentagon office, reviewed the incident reports with the cold pragmatism that characterized his leadership style. The 64-year-old fleet admiral from Ohio had overseen the Navy's transformation from Pearl Harbor's devastation to Pacific dominance, and he understood that total war sometimes demanded harsh decisions from subordinate commanders. King's assessment, preserved in Joint Chiefs of Staff archives, supported the principle that submarine commanders possessed the authority to defend their vessels against any perceived threat. The document emphasized that second-guessing tactical decisions made under combat conditions could undermine the aggressive spirit that made American submarines so effective against Japanese shipping. The legal precedents governing submarine warfare provided additional support for official endorsement of Morton's actions. International maritime law recognized the right of naval vessels to defend themselves against hostile action, regardless of the source. Legal experts within the Judge Advocate General's office determined that organized resistance from armed survivors constituted a legitimate threat that justified aggressive response. British representatives, privately informed of the incident through intelligence-sharing channels, expressed concerns about casualties among Commonwealth prisoners of war. However, diplomatic protocols prevented public criticism of Allied military operations, particularly those conducted by American forces under American command. The strategic alliance required careful management of such sensitive issues to maintain coalition unity against the Axis powers. The official Navy Department position, communicated through Admiral King's office to congressional liaison officers, characterized the incident as a legitimate combat action conducted according to established rules of engagement. The statement emphasized that submarine commanders operated under extreme conditions that required immediate tactical decisions based on available information. Morton himself expressed no regret about his actions during post-patrol debriefings with intelligence officers. The aggressive submarine commander maintained that his primary responsibility was protecting his crew and completing assigned missions against enemy forces. Decades after the last depth charge exploded in Pacific waters, the Buyo Maru incident continued to generate controversy among military historians, legal scholars, and moral philosophers examining the conduct of World War II submarine warfare. On 26 January 1943, during an intense action, the USS Wahoo, SS-238, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, attacked the survivors of the Japanese transport Buyo Maru. The engagement became a case study in the ethical complexities of total warfare and the impossible decisions faced by combat commanders operating under extreme conditions. The revelation that 195 Indian POWs and 87 Japanese died during the submarine attack fundamentally altered historical assessment of Morton's actions. Post-war investigations revealed that the majority of casualties were Commonwealth soldiers who had been captured during Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia, not willing combatants deserving of enemy fire. The disproportionate death toll among prisoners of war raised serious questions about the incident's compliance with international humanitarian law. Naval historians have spent decades analyzing the tactical situation that led to Morton's controversial decision. The submarine commander's perspective, filtered through the fog of war and the imperative to protect his crew, created a scenario where tragic mistakes became inevitable. Modern analysis suggests that the chaotic conditions following the torpedo attack, combined with language barriers and the visual similarity between Japanese soldiers and Indian prisoners wearing similar uniforms, made accurate target identification virtually impossible from the Wahoo's bridge. The legal implications of the incident became clearer as historians gained access to previously classified documents. The Hague Convention of 1907 bans the killing of shipwreck survivors under any circumstances, establishing international legal standards that prohibit attacks on maritime disaster survivors regardless of their military status. However, the convention's provisions were written before the development of modern submarine warfare tactics and didn't adequately address situations where survivors actively resisted rescue or attacked their potential rescuers. Contemporary submarine warfare experts argue that Morton's actions must be evaluated within the context of Pacific theater combat conditions rather than by peacetime legal standards. Japanese military doctrine emphasized resistance to the death rather than surrender, creating tactical situations where submarine commanders couldn't distinguish between legitimate defensive actions and war crimes. The cultural and military factors that shaped Japanese conduct during the war contributed to the tragic circumstances that led to the lifeboat attacks. The psychological impact on the Wahoo's crew became evident in post-war interviews with surviving veterans. Several crew members expressed conflicted emotions about the incident, describing pride in their submarine's tactical success, while acknowledging discomfort with the unusual nature of attacking survivors in lifeboats. The moral complexity of the situation reflected broader challenges faced by combat personnel throughout the Pacific War. British military historians have emphasized the tragedy of Commonwealth casualties during what should have been an American victory over Japanese forces. The Indian prisoners of war who died in the attack were serving soldiers of the British Empire who deserved protection rather than destruction. Their deaths represented a diplomatic and moral complication that strained Allied cooperation despite official efforts to minimize the incident's political impact. Modern naval warfare doctrine has incorporated lessons learned from the Buyo Maru incident into training programs for submarine commanders. Contemporary military education emphasizes the importance of positive target identification and the legal obligations regarding civilian casualties during combat operations. The incident serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of incomplete intelligence and the tragic potential for friendly fire incidents during complex military operations. The ultimate irony of the Buyo Maru incident lies in its strategic insignificance compared to its moral complexity. Morton's aggressive submarine campaign continued successfully for months after the controversial engagement, contributing significantly to the eventual collapse of Japanese maritime logistics. The tactical success of American submarine warfare helped shorten the Pacific War and potentially saved thousands of Allied lives, but at the cost of moral compromises that continue to trouble historians and ethicists examining the conflict's conduct. Lieutenant Commander Morton died with his crew when the Wahoo was sunk by Japanese forces on October 11, 1943, taking with him the personal motivations and tactical reasoning that led to one of submarine warfare's most controversial decisions.